Welcome back to our next session. Please take your seats. And I would like you to welcome to the stage Dr. Rebecca Nadin, who's going to talk to us about is China winning in the Global South? Thank you. So I think all of you have a copy of Rebecca's report, Rebecca with her colleagues, The New Cold War, Who is Courting the Global South, which I highly recommend. There's a copy there for you all. And we're going to explore some of the main themes raised in the report. Now, I think I'm right in saying nearly 60% of the world's population is in the Global South, and there's some dispute about the term. Some people hate the terminology, others prefer the term developing world. Some people hate that term as well. But if we stick with the term Global South, we in essence mean the many countries outside Europe that didn't align with either the US or the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And a lot's changed, particularly the rise of China and how these countries see the world. And we're very lucky we have an expert to guide us through this, Dr. Rebecca Nadin, Director of Global Risks and Reliance Team at ODI, which, as you'll know, is a think tank committed to research on international economics and development. And you lead the Global China 2049 project, and you spent 16 years in China, including a spell at the British Embassy in Beijing. So tell us firstly about the origin of that term, the Global South, and the non-aligned movement. Is it a useful term?
Well, it's certainly a term that has been risen in popularity over the past few months. But as you say, Ian, that term is used to describe countries in the developing world. It's used to describe low-income countries. China, though, actually uses the term South-South cooperation when it talks about the developing world. And China sees itself and positions itself very much as a developing country. And as you say, I was in China for many years. I was there under Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. And during that time, I had various roles and some of that time in government. And during that period, China, the importance of positioning itself as a developing country is very important to China's strategic ambitions.
Why is it so important? Why does the Global South matter so much to successive Chinese leaderships?
I think that's a really important question, because at the minute we tend to break everything down when we're talking about China to China's ambitions around reforming the international system, world order, and that is in part true. But fundamentally, when we're talking about China, we're talking about what is important to China domestically. So much of my work focuses on not how the world sees China, but how China sees the world. So, for example, engagement with the Global South, or engagement with China's neighbours, China's periphery, as it describes, China's neighbourhood diplomacy, periphery diplomacy, is absolutely paramount to China's ambitions around national rejuvenation. So we've heard this term a lot, and we tend to attribute that to Xi Jinping, but actually China's ambitions to rejuvenate the country to this truly modern socialist country with a world-class military by 2049 is not actually a Xi Jinping goal. This is a Communist Party goal. This originates, actually it first appears national rejuvenation in 1997. Jiang Zemin talks about this. And because China understands that in order to, with a country that's 2/3 of its borders are with other countries, it's 14 countries that border China, it matters how China engages with these regions. And it matters for several reasons. First of all, it matters because engaging a comprehensive and having a stable policy, stable external environment is critical for China's domestic ambitions. First of all, as I mentioned, this goal of national rejuvenation. It's important because it's about building economic connectivity. So the engagement with, for example, Central Asia comes about because in the late 90s, Jiang Zemin focuses on the going out policy, which is developing the western regions of China. So this is Xinjiang, the provinces in the west, and about building connectivity, transport corridors, economic corridors, trading corridors, and through, as we know from the Silk Road. And then also it's about using the Global South as a testing ground for some of China's ideas. So we have China's developed the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and more recently, on the eve when the US implemented more bans on China's access to higher advanced chips, the Global AI Initiative. So this becomes a testing ground with the Global South. But then finally, what's also critically important for China in terms of its engagement with the Global South is it needs the Global South in order to maintain its position as a developing country. So you can't be the champion of the Global South if you yourself are not a developing country. And developing country status is also very important for a whole range of other pieces of international law treaties. So let's take the UNFCCC, the climate talks. You know, China is not an Annex 1 country in that. And it sticks very clearly to its common but differentiated responsibilities.
To what extent is it about resources and the fight for resources?
Resources certainly play a key part in that. I think one of the challenges of our understanding of China is that we tend to take China from almost as if China's engagement with the world starts when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2013, and this is a very dangerous way to view China. So China's ambitions around self-reliance, technological advancement go back way to the 1970s. Actually, under Mao, China isolated itself. But with the reform period, the four modernizations, in the 70s, China is talking about building up supply chain. In 1991, Deng Xiaoping says, the Middle East has oil, but China has rare earths. We need to make a good job of rare earths. So we're now talking about rare earths in 2023, but China's been thinking about rare earths since the early 90s, and if not before. And what China certainly understands when we talk about, let's take Taiwan, like a Taiwan contingency. So we're focused all the time on will they, won't they invade, will they, won't they invade. But actually, to me, the real question is, what is China doing to insulate itself if there is a Taiwanese contingency? Or, if there are increasingly sanctions. So it's learning a lot from what's happening in Ukraine on sanctions. So it's looking at these land corridors. So if we go back to the sort of 19th century Mackinder Eurasian land bridge, it's thinking about supply chains. It's thinking about, yes, tech critical minerals, but it's thinking about food security. It's thinking about energy security. And again, these are not new concerns for China. But we saw in 2015 a very different framing of national security. So China suddenly expands its definition of national security to move beyond what it describes as traditional concepts, again, around sort of territorial integrity, sovereignty, but to start thinking about energy security, food security, technological self-reliance. How do you insulate yourself from increasing Western sanctions?
So we hear a lot in the free world about decoupling, though actually a lot of the data suggests that that's not necessarily happening, that there's a gap between the political rhetoric about decoupling Western economies from the Chinese economy. There's still a hell of a lot of trade. That's very interesting. You're saying, in that sense, they're ahead of us in terms of thinking about insulation in case this does turn into these tensions turn into outright conflicts.
Yes, absolutely, and that's very much embedded in Chinese risk analysis. Because we tend to think, again, that China's understanding of the complex geopolitical situation comes about with Xi Jinping, but actually the party has been very, very good at running comprehensive risk analysis. So, for example, perhaps the longest risk assessment in history was the party's analysis of the breakup of the Soviet Union. So a very esteemed China academic, Richard Baum, coins it post-Soviet stress syndrome, and the party really looked at that, understanding the domestic drivers, the geopolitical drivers. But I think what's important again to understand with China is we talk about China as if it's just either Beijing, or just this homogenous entity, but you're actually talking about 23 different provinces, with some of those provinces with the GDP of Germany, with the combined GDP of US and EU, sorry. You've got 23 provinces, 5 autonomous regions, 4 municipalities. You're talking about very, very different, distinct entities. And everything that the Chinese government is thinking about is how do we keep that social contract between the people and the party. So, interestingly, at the same time, China's making statements about Israel-Palestine, about engagement in the Middle East. It also, Xi Jinping last week chairs a Politburo meeting on Chinese nation integration. So this is directed at ethnic minorities in China. So prior to Xi Jinping, well, even in the beginning of Xi Jinping's tenure, it's about giving autonomy to China's ethnic minorities. But actually we see at the same time, I don't think it's a coincidence, China's also doubling down and saying, yes, Hui minority, yes, Uyghur minority, you can have your religion, your culture, but it has to be with Chinese characteristics. And there's a big doubling down. So China, on the one hand, in the international space, is saying, yes, we'll be your voice. We will give voice to the global South, give voice to different disparate countries, but at the same time, domestically, we're going to double down.
So we hear a lot of contradictory reports coming out of China about the state of the economy. I mean, on the one hand, the author of that big book on China, Age of Ambition, published a piece last week, which I recommend to you, which I think is called The Age of Malaise, which is about the breakdown of the social compact, and a lot of focus on China's property crash and broader economic problems. But then investors and various other people come back from China and say, well, don't necessarily fall for that. China is not retreating economically in quite the way that you think, or declining. How do you think we should see it?
Again, I think we need to understand that China is not this homogenous whole. So I agree that there is, absolutely, you're right, the property crash, you've got very high provincial debt, indebtedness, you've got demographic challenges. Although one of the other big challenges actually is youth underemployment, but actually that's also not necessarily a new challenge. I mean, one of the causes of Tiananmen unrest actually in '89 was there was a feeling that the muscles were being paid more than the brains, so the intellectuals weren't being gainfully employed.
And you now have a graduate class that feels that it's not achieving in employment terms what it was promised when it went to university. Exactly.
But we can see in the past week, China absolutely doubling down on trying to solve some of these problems. So in the Dongbei, in the northeast region, lot of state-owned enterprises there, heavy industry. So big focus on trying to develop economic policies to reinvigorate that area. A big doubling down again on Xinjiang. So there's now indications that Xinjiang will become a free trade zone in about 5 years. So this will have significant impact actually how China is trading with Central Asia. Of course, that being said, and I think this is an important point when we talk about China and perhaps to a certain extent Russia, but I know China better, that we tend to think that China is all-powerful and all-doing, and that when they're engaging with these countries, that there is no agency of the countries themselves. So to negotiate better deals with China. And in the case of Central Asia, there is quite a bit of xenophobia. So Kyrgyzstan, for example.
I mean, difficult to generalise, but how is this seen, do you think, from the perspective of the Global South? 5 years ago, the consensus would have been pre-pandemic that China was definitely winning in the Global South, and that the West had failed to get its act together, Belt and Road, and all of the initiatives that you mentioned earlier. How does it look now?
I think it's interesting when we talk about the Global South, it's the who. So China's engagement tends to be bilateral. So they talk a lot about multilateralism, but this is actually, again, multilateralism with Chinese characteristics. So a lot of the engagement actually is bilateral. It's also elite to elite. And from some of the work that we've been doing, looking at some of the risks along the Belt and Road, there are, at the kind of grassroots level, there is certainly some disquiet in some of these countries about China coming in, again, around jobs, so China bringing in workers, around not sticking to some of the local customs, sort of taking over, that sort of thing. So I think the views are varied, but particularly though when the Global South, to generalise, is talking, it is from those elites. And what China has been very good at, and the West hasn't been so good at perhaps, is actually listening to what the socio-economic development needs are of these countries. And I think energy security is quite a good example to showcase some of this sentiment, is that Mozambique, Senegal, for example, been trying, significant fossil fuel, natural resources, had been trying to get loans and investment from World Bank, from the EU, but for, a good 10, 15 years, a lot of conditionality placed on those. No, you need to invest green, it needs to be about net zero. Cut to the Ukraine conflict, suddenly energy security is right up on the agenda for many European capitals. So we had the German Chancellor going out to Mozambique, the previous Italian Prime Minister in Senegal, and those countries are naturally saying, well, it's energy hypocrisy. Now you're saying it's fine for us to develop these fossil fuel power plants, etc. But previously you were saying that wasn't, because it was all about net zero. And I think China, particularly with its Global Development Initiative and others, is saying, actually, for us, you talk about the West, you talk about human rights, but actually we place development as a human right, the right to develop as a human right. So it's taking a different view on human rights approaches, so moving away from that sort of rights of the individual to the greater good. And I think that resonates in certain capitals. But China is also engaging and cooperating and training law enforcement, judiciary, in a lot of these other countries as well.
Now we're going to move to some questions. I have some more questions of my own as well, but who has the first question on China? Row 3, thank you. There's a mic on its way to you.
Thank you very much. James Wellesley Wesley. The demographic issues with China playing out over the next 75 years are obviously kind of well known. There's something of a collapse in the population. How does China view that, and how do you think It avoids the normal expectation of some sort of economic collapse.
So it is a concern of the government, and there is they are trying to encourage people to have couples to have more children. I think what they're also deeply concerned about is falling into the middle income trap. I mean, I'm skeptical about China's economic collapse. I think the Communist Party has many tools at its disposal, fiscal and monetary policy, that other countries don't. But as I said as well, are we talking about economic collapse of the whole country or certain provinces, certain regions? And in the rural population, still the demographic situation is not as dire. So we're talking again about the cities here. But this seems to be a problem as well for many countries, including in Europe.
Any more questions? Question there?
Jordan Anderson with S&P. So with, especially in the African continent, a number of countries increasingly having a resource nationalist mood, wanting to keep more of the value chain domestically, and with both the United States and Europe increasingly willing to step up and fund some of this development, how do you see China responding to that? Seeing some of these developments are being done almost implicitly with the intention of competing with China for access to critical resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that China is also acutely aware of, and what we have seen in some African countries, so a shift from exporting of raw materials to actually China now investing in processing in country. We've also seen changes in the investment patterns more broadly, whether it is in raw materials mining or whether it's in digital. So we're seeing really an increase in China going into more mergers and acquisitions, less investment in kind of brownfield sites. But I think, yeah, there's definitely changes in some of the relationships, particularly like in countries like Zimbabwe and others, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about Russia in this context. Where does Russia fit in the global south?
Well, my colleague's probably better to talk on Russian perspectives.
But it's there as a it's strange, isn't it? It's a potential rival to China in those parts of the world, but also in other senses a strategic partner. Yeah,
I think Russia is not going to be able to compete against China in terms of the investment, in terms of FDI, etc. Where I think actually there's potential for sort of the two countries rubbing up against each other in the wrong way, I think is with entities such as Wagner, such
Precisely,
as the PMCs and the PSCs, so particularly as China now has many more overseas assets. So I think that would be very diplomatically very challenging if some Chinese nationals were killed, etc. But China is very good at managing that narrative domestically. So within the Israel-Palestine conflict, a number of, I think 2 Chinese workers, have been killed. And in other conflicts, China really manages how much of that information goes back to the general public. I mean, it's very good when they're doing, like when they evacuated people from Sudan, really putting this out. China, the motherland really looks after you, and you can rely on the motherland. But actually, looking at Weibo, you could see actually that there was a few sort of not so polite sentiment from Chinese nationals about the Chinese government's handling.
Final question: how should the West, for want of a better term, the free world, to use another term, how should it respond Can it respond?
I think the first thing that the West needs to do is really get real a little bit on China. So really understand where China is coming from. So this isn't about being a hawk or a dove or a China apologist. This is about fundamentally understanding what is driving Chinese behaviour. You know, what is critically important to China. So we had at the start of this year the 2 sessions. China, there she talks about the need to balance comparative connectivity, so this is globalization, with self-reliance. China talks about upgrading the diplomatic budget by about 13%. And it also says, we are going to look at certain aspects of international law and we want to reform that. Whereas the West sees China wants to reform the entire rules-based international order. Well, it doesn't. It actually wants to reform some very important bits of the rules-based internet, so UNCLOS, so legal questions around use of autonomous weapons, space, deep ocean, you know, but we're so busy focusing on breaking everything down into this ideological battle between good and evil that we're actually completely missing the point. And China's saying to us all, we are focused on food security, we are focused on massively expanding our grain storage, so this is going to have impacts on food prices. We're really focused on rules on international law in space, on how do you deal with space debris. We're focused on lunar mining, deep ocean mining. Yeah. So I think the West really needs to understand that a little more.
But in Cold War 1.0, it was in a sense easier to understand because the Soviet Union clearly, it was clear what it wanted. It advocated a global system run according to Marxist-Leninist thinking. But I think it's quite hard sometimes for people to work out, what does China want? What do you think it wants out of all this?
Well, it also wants, yes, it wants
Does it want to dominate the West, or
it wants
does it want
a
control?
system, and it's always wanted this, that is conducive to Chinese domestic goals, and those goals are the rejuvenation of China with the aspiring goal of having this socialist modern country by 2049, world-class military. It's about feeding its people, giving gainful employment to its people, managing its very complex environmental challenges, you know, which did come about to a certain degree from, you know, the Deng era of get rich, clean up later. So I think, again, and I'm sure people say, oh, you know, you're a China apologist. I'm not, but having lived there for so long, it is about people. When you talk to people in Beijing or people in the countryside in China, you know, they're not talking about Chinese domination. They're talking about, can they get their children into a good school? Can they get affordable housing? Can they get to work easily? Can they get a new car? Just the same things that others talk about. And the party, the focus of the party at the minute is on this wealth disparity.
But the danger could be if that doesn't work out. Sometimes historically, we know regimes that are in a corner then turn to war.
Yes.
So I know you're always asked about China, Taiwan.
Yeah.
But where are you on sort of risk register on this? Is it, you know, final question, is it likely in 2024?
Well, I mean, you know, one election we didn't talk about is the Taiwanese election. So this is going to be very important. At the moment, the front-running candidate is the DDP candidate, who China sees very much as a separatist candidate. So that will have implications. How the US behaves will also have implications. But I think with China and Taiwan, we were very much focused on a kinetic response. But before China gets to a kinetic response, there are many things that China can and is doing already. I would argue that the military response is a strategy to the political, social, cultural, economic strategy that China is deploying on Taiwan. I mean, China could totally disrupt trade in the Malacca-Taiwan Straits simply by doing more of the Coast Guard exercises that it does. It doesn't necessarily need to go into a full-blown military amphibious assault to do that. And China, in terms of its own risks, because we tend to not talk too much about the big security challenges that China has on its border, Afghanistan being one. China cares deeply about that. North Korea. I mean, you know, China, it would be not inconceivable that if China goes into Taiwan militarily, that North Korea doesn't go into South Korea. And the last thing that China wants is a whole military conflict on the Korean peninsula, plus, you know, hundreds of thousands of North Korean refugees going into North China, plus then, of course, India. So I think there are many things, you know, before we get to that China can usefully employ. But China is also very clear about what creates tension on the Taiwan Straits and what is a red line for China on the Taiwan Straits.
So we're now going to move to a short break, and then we're going to make up some time before we have the next session with Alan Brown. But until then, I want you to show your appreciation for this fascinating insight. Thank you, Rebecca.